Authentication is key for APIs, and in this video what we're going to do is we're going to add JWT or JWT Authentication to our Django REST Framework API. And this method of authentication is going to allow your clients to send a token in an HTTP header, and REST Framework is then going to be able to look at that token and verify whether or not that request should be permitted at a given endpoint. Now let's start with a look at this authentication page in the REST Framework documentation. So authentication is the mechanism of associating an incoming request with a set of identifying credentials, such as the user that the request came from or the token that it was signed with. The REST Framework provides different authentication schemes out of the box, and it allows you to implement custom schemes as well. And authentication always runs at the very start of a view, and that's before permission and throttling checks will occur, and before any other code is allowed to proceed. Now there's two properties to look at here. Request.user, just like in Django, that exists on the Django REST Framework request object, and that will typically be set to an instance of the 𝗏𝗡𝗆 user class. And for additional authentication information, you have the request.auth property. And for example, you might use that to represent an authentication token that the request was signed with. There's some more information on this page, such as how authentication is determined. And you define your authentication schemes as a list of REST Framework authentication classes. And what REST Framework will do is it will attempt to authenticate with each class in the list, and it's going to set request.user and request.auth using the return value of the first class that successfully authenticates. And if no class authenticates, request.user is going to be set to the anonymous user object in the Django auth package. Now we're going to start here by setting the authentication scheme. So what you can do here is set your REST Framework setting in Django. And I'm actually just going to copy this for now. And we're going to go to VS Code. And I'm going to open up settings.py. And I don't think in this series we've got a REST Framework setting. So what we're going to do is go to the very bottom of settings.py. And we're going to add that now. So I'm going to paste that code in there. And we have a property or a key in the dictionary called default authentication classes. Now the two that were listed in that example are basic authentication and session authentication. These are two different authentication schemes. Basic authentication is going to send an encoded string in the authorization header of the HTTP request, and then session authentication is slightly different. And in fact, I think it's best if we go to the documentation on these. If we go to the API reference here, basic authentication is documented in this link here. And one important thing to note, as you can see at the bottom, if you use basic authentication in production, you should ensure that your API is only available over HTTPS. In other words, that has to be a secure request. And that's because there is username and password information available in the HTTP headers, so these must not be available over normal HTTP protocol. We're going to look at token authentication in a bit, but we're also going to look at session authentication here. And that's Django's default session backend for authentication. So if you're familiar with Django and things like the login required decorator and how to access the user property, by default that is all using session-based authentication. And that's what we're currently using at the moment when we log into the admin of this API, or if we use the Django REST Framework browsable API. So let's see an example of that. I'm going to start the Django development server in this project. And now that that's started, let's go back to the browser here, and I'm going to open up the Django admin. Now when we go to the Django admin, we can log in with a username and a password. So I'm going to do that just now, and that is using session authentication in order to do that. And what happens here is that it generates a session ID that's stored in a cookie, and Django will use the ID from that cookie that's sent in subsequent requests in order to verify who the user is. So that's what's going on here at the moment, but what we want to do is add a different mechanism for authentication, and that's going to be JSON Web Token based authentication. So if we go back here to the authentication documentation, we're going to look at token based authentication now. And Django REST Framework provides a simple implementation of token authentication. So let's scroll down and have a look at this. And this is appropriate for client-server setups such as native desktop and mobile clients. Now this is a simple implementation, and you have token objects built into REST Framework here. And the way that these are sent in the request is you have an authorization header, and you set this to token, and then you have the actual value of the token in the value of that header. And if you successfully authenticate, token authentication is going to provide you with the request.user property, as do the other types, but you also get in the request.auth property a token instance. And again, if you use this in production, you should ensure that your API is only available over HTTPS. Now what I want to do is go to the left hand side, and we're going to look at some third-party packages here. And the one that we're going to use here is for JSON Web Token authentication. And that's a fairly new standard, as it says here. I don't think it's that new now, but I could be wrong. And it's used for token-based authentication. And one of the key differences between the built-in token authentication scheme and JWT authentication is that when you use these JSON Web Tokens, you don't actually need to use a database in order to validate a token. Now that has the benefit, obviously, of preventing a database lookup every time a request comes in. Now that single database lookup is not usually a big limitation on your application, but it is nice to prevent that every time a request comes in. And the package that we're going to use for JWT or JWT authentication is this one here. So let's click this and we're going to get taken to the GitHub page for that package. So I'm on that page now, and this is a JSON Web Token authentication plugin for REST Framework. And it's got 4,000 stars, as you can see here. So let's go down and we're going to start by installing this. And we're going to visit the documentation, and let me make the text bigger here so we can see it. We're going to go to the Getting Started page. Now there's a pip install command here. Let's copy that and go back to our application. I'm going to stop the Django development server, and we can paste that in here, and that's going to install the simple JWT package into the Python virtual environment, and we're using pip in this video. We can clear the terminal now and go back to the documentation. Now you can optionally install some different cryptographic dependencies here. So there are certain digital signature algorithms that you can use to encode and decode these tokens. If you're going to use some of those, then you need to install the cryptography library. So you can add this to the end of the command if you need those algorithms. Now in order to configure this, what we're going to do is we're going to add to our default authentication classes this one here. So let's copy that, and we're going to go back to VS Code, and let's go back to this setting here, default authentication classes. I'm going to remove basic authentication, and just underneath session authentication, I'm going to paste this one in here. So that's JWT authentication, and that comes from the simple JWT package here and the authentication module in that package. Now we're going to keep session authentication here, but I'm going to move that to the bottom actually, and we're going to provide this as a fallback if JWT authentication fails. And the reason for that is that we want to actually continue using the Django admin, and we need session authentication for that. So let's save this file, and we're going to keep both of these in the default authentication classes setting. Now if we go back to the documentation, once we have added this, what we can do in our root URL configuration is we can include routes for simple JWT's token obtain pair view and token refresh view views. So I'm going to copy the code here, and then we're going to look at what those do in a second. Let's go to the project urls.py file, and we're going to paste in the imports, and I'm going to set the Python virtual environment here in VS Code. So we've now imported these two views from the simple JWT module. What we can do is go back here and add these two URL patterns, and these are going to be added to the URL patterns list that we've got here. So I'm going to paste these in at the bottom, and we can then save this. So at the API endpoint /API/token, we're going to call the token obtain pair view. And as it says in VS Code, this is going to take a set of user credentials, and it's going to return an access and refresh JSON Web Token pair to prove the authentication of those credentials. So basically you send your user credentials to this view here, to the endpoint, and what you get back is an access and a refresh token, as we're going to see soon. On the other hand, we have a second endpoint here, API/token/refresh, and that's going to call the token refresh view. And what this does is it takes the refresh token that you got back from the obtain pair view above, and it's then going to return a new accessed JSON Web Token if your refresh token is valid. So let's save urls.py, and what we're going to do now is we're going to go back to that REST client file that we had in the previous video, and that was this api.http file. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add some new requests at the bottom of this file to our new endpoints. So let's start by copying this request that we've got here. I'm going to bring that down into our new request. So we're going to send a new post request, and the URL that we're going to send that to is /API/token. So let's add that to this URL. And again, the content type is going to be application/JSON. Now that is going to have to contain a body that contains two keys. So first of all, the username, and I'm going to set this to a username of admin. And then we're going to also have a password here being sent in the request body. And I'm going to set the password to test. Now that's the actual credentials for my admin user in this application. That guy has the username of admin and the password of test. So let's test out this post request now. If we hit send request here, we're getting a message at the bottom that the connection was rejected. and that is because I'm not running the Django server. So let's start the Django development server at the bottom, and we can test this out again. Let's hit send request, and we get back the response at the right hand side. It's a 200 OK response, and we have two keys in the response body. We get a refresh token here, and you can see also our access token here. So the access token is the most important one. That's the one you're going to add to the HTTP authorization header. So after you get back the token from Django, Django has verified that the user with these credentials is correct. That exists in the database, that matches, and then it gives you back an access token that you then add to that header, and you send that every time you send a subsequent request to any endpoint that requires an access token. Now, just to demonstrate that you don't get back this response if the credentials are incorrect, I'm going to change the password here to tests, and then we hit send request, and we're going to get back a different response, and we have no active account found with the given credentials. So obviously when you send this request, the credentials must be correct in order to get back the access and the refresh token. So this access token is actually a JSON Web Token, and I'm going to copy that value, and we're going to go to this website, jwt.io, and this gives you some information about JSON Web Tokens. They are an open industry standard for representing claims securely between two parties. Now this website allows you to decode a JWT token, so we're going to do that just now, and what I'm going to do is paste what I copied into this encoded section here, and we get the decoded JWT on the right hand side. Now JSON Web Tokens contain three parts. We have a header, we have a payload, and I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so we can see these. We have a payload, and we also have a signature at the bottom. Now let's start by looking at the header. We have an algorithm property here, and this tells you what algorithm was used to encrypt or sign the JSON Web Token. Now more interestingly, we have the payload of data, and this tells you information such as the token type, this is an access token, and also the expiry time as well. And importantly for Django, we can identify the user here using the user ID that's part of this payload, and that's set to the user ID of 1. And having that user ID in the payload, that's why we don't need to do a database lookup to actually identify the user based on this JSON Web Token. We simply have the user ID present in the payload when we decode the JSON Web Token, and we then know that this is the user with the ID of 1. Now what I want to do just now is take this token here, and we're going to add it to a header that we have in one of the other calls to this API. Now remember from the previous video, when we send a post request to create a new product, we need to be an admin user in order to do that. And beforehand, when we send this request, we don't have authentication credentials. So that's going to fail. We cannot create a new product in the database using a post request at the moment. But if we add an authorization header here, and we set this to bearer and then paste the value of our JSON Web Token, and make sure this is the access token that we paste in here and not the refresh token. When we add that to the authorization header and we send this request, this time we get back the new product data. So that product has now been created in the database, and even though it was rejected before we added this authorization header, now we've added the header and we've set the bearer token here using that header. And again, if we change any part of this and save this and send the request, we get some message here that the token is not valid for any token type. So we need to have a valid authorization token in the header in order to get back a valid response. Now what I'm going to do is go back to views.py, and let's look at the code for this again from the getPermissions method on this listCreateAPIView subclass. So by default, when a GET request is sent, we are allowing the response. It's going to give back a list of products. But if it's a POST request, as it is in this method here, as you can see, it's a POST request. In that case, we're going to set self.permission classes, and we're going to override the value above. We're going to change that, and we're going to set it to the isAdminUser. So this request here and the access token must be associated with an admin user in order to give that user the ability to create a product in the database. Now just to verify this, what I'm going to do is go to the Django admin, and I'm going to add a Django user here that's not an administrator. So let's go back to the terminal, or go back to the browser, sorry, and go back to the Django admin. We don't have the ability to look at users at the moment, so what I'm going to do is go back to the project here, and let's load up the admin.py file that's in this application. Now I'm going to import from our models the user model that we've overridden. So we're setting a custom user model here, and then at the bottom I'm just going to register that. So let's copy this line of code, and we're going to register our user model, and we don't need to override the admin class here. Let's just register it and go back to the Django admin and refresh this page. Now let's click through to the users page, and we can see we have two users at the moment, but they are both admin users. We want to actually make one of these users a normal user who's not able to log into the Django admin. So I'm going to go to John Doe here, and if we scroll down, we have a tick box for staff status. And this designates whether the user can log into the admin site or not. I'm going to untick that, and we're going to save this, and now John Doe is not an admin user. So what we can do in order to test the the permission class that we have here called isAdminUser, is we can go back to api.http, and I'm going to go down to this request that we're sending to get an access token. So we're going to change the username here to John Doe, and I think the password is also test. So what we can do is send the request here, and we get back a response that contains our access token. And let me minimize the sidebar here. We're going to copy the access token, and again we're going to bring that into the request to create a product above here. So let me close the response here, and we're going to change the bearer token that's used to the one that we got back for John Doe. So let me try removing this just now, and we're going to add our new bearer token, our new JWT token for John Doe. So let's paste that in here. Now the key insight here is that we have an access token for John Doe, but John Doe is not an admin user. So in the case that we send a post request, we're going to set the permission classes to isAdminUser, but John Doe is not an admin user, so he should not be able to create that product in the database. So let's test this out. Let's go back to api.http, and we're going to send this request with the new token, and we get back this detail message here. And the message is telling us that we don't have permission to perform this action. So we need to be logged in using an admin user, such as the admin user that we have. So that guy had a username of admin. If we send that request, again, we get back an access token. We can copy this access token here, and we can go back to the product create call. And if we remove this token here, we can then paste in the token for the admin user again, and then we can send that request, and this time we get back the response, and we've created that new product in the database, and we have a status code of 201 created. So that's just demonstrating another permission class in Django REST Framework, the isAdminUser permission. And now we have actually protected our API by default if we go to settings.py using JWT Authentication. And we have the session authentication fallback for the Django admin UI. So anytime we add these permission classes to any of the views that we have in the application, for example, this isAdminUser one here, we are now going to require that one of those two authentication schemes is successfully met in order to actually allow the user to perform that given action. And that will apply to our other permission classes section that we've got here for the user order list API view. So let's just very quickly test this out as well. Let's go to api.http, and I'm going to copy the GET request at the top, and let's go to the bottom here, and we're going to add another GET request. So we can add the 3 hashes here, and we can add our new request. And I think the request here, if we go back to views.py, this is for user order list API view. So let's go to urls.py, and we can find the actual URL associated with that, and that was /user-orders. So let's copy this and bring that into the URL. So at the moment, if we send this GET request, we're going to get back a response, as we can see on the right hand side. We need authentication credentials to be supplied in order to get back the response with the user orders. And the reason for that is because the permission class is authenticated. Now what we can do again is go back to api.http, and we can copy the token and the authorization header from the other endpoint, and we can paste that in here. And once we do that, we can save this and send the request. And this time we get back the list of the user's orders. So again, all we need to do here with the JSON Web Tokens is add them to the authorization header, and Django can then verify that that's a valid token, and it knows the user that's associated with that token, and it can send them back the appropriate response here, because if we look at the actual getQuerySet method, that's referencing self.request.user. Django knows who that user is from the token based on the decoded token payload. So I hope that all makes sense. Just to finish the video, I want to make sure that the tests that we wrote earlier on are still working. So python manage.py test, let's run that command, and we're going to see what output we get here. And we're getting back this error here that the response status code of 401 does not match what we expect, and we're expecting a 403 response now. So I'm going to try and find out the reason for that, and then we can update the test. Now I think the reason for this, now that I've looked into it a little bit, is due to this page here, and I think we looked at this earlier in the series, but we're going to look at it again now. So when permission checks fail, you're either going to get a 403 forbidden or a 401 unauthorized response. Now previously we got a 403 forbidden response, but we get the 401 unauthorized in the final bullet point here, so let's look at that one. Now you get this response when the request was not successfully authenticated, and the highest priority authentication class does use the 𝗵𝗵𝗹 headers. Now we're back in settings.py and we've changed the highest priority authentication class to JWT Authentication. It's highest priority because it's first in the list of default authentication classes. So I think we can just simply update the test now that we've changed that. So if we go back to tests.py, we can change the status here from HTTP 403 forbidden. So let's change that to 401 unauthorized. If we save that and we go back to the terminal now and we rerun the test command, we're going to see that the tests pass successfully. And you can see that on the terminal. And I think that's the way to resolve this. If you are familiar with any better ways, or if you think that's wrong and you have anything that you'd like to add in the comments, please do so. I think it's simply a case that we've changed the default or the highest priority authentication class, and that's changed the response code that we've got here. So that's all for this video. We've added JSON Web Token based authentication to our API with Django REST Framework, and we're using the 𝗵𝗽𝗁𝗟 package, and that's this one here, and there's a link to that in the description of the video. And we can now authenticate using a token that's present in the authorization header of HTTP requests that are coming into our API. In the next video, we're going to move on to update and delete endpoints for our API. And we're going to show how we can modify existing data in the database and also delete data from the database using those endpoints and using REST Framework views that are capable of performing those actions. So that's all for this video. Again, if you'd like to support the channel, please check out the Ko-fi link that we have in the description, and that'll help keep this content free on YouTube. And don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.